All right, guys, welcome back to Hokma Woodworking. I'm Brandon, and it's spring. You know what that means. Garden boxes. It's still wood, we're still making sawdust, and that's all I aim to do anytime I come out in the shop is just make some sawdust, right? This is gonna be serving my wife, my kids, doing some gardening this year, learning how to do all that, and making some sustainable meals out of our own garden, which is always nice. It's definitely something I did when I was a kid. My mom did the gardening, but I was always there with doing the hard labor and of course helping pick at the end of it with beans and carrots and cucumbers and whatever else goes into that. So in this episode, we're going to be diving into putting a raised bed together, from the dimensions that you need to sourcing the material, big orange box, blue box, whichever one you go to, or any other wood supplier that you have, and then assembly. So pretty simple. You do want to use treated lumber, would be preferable in the United States, I believe. Throughout, it is now has to be non-arsenic treated lumber, but you might check with your lumber yard if it's not one of the bigger boxes to make sure that's what you got. Don't use any railroad ties, don't use any telephone poles. Those might have been treated with some of that harsher chemical, and that stuff will leach into your dirt and into your vegetables. You don't want that. From everything that I've researched, the leaching off of this type of material from the new stuff that they're using is almost non-existent, but you should do that research and look that up yourself. You could also line these things with plastic to prevent some of that even further. It would also help make the wood last longer, even though it is treated. You know, weather is gonna still be beating on it with the sun and everything else that goes into that. So what goes into a garden box? Wood. Right? You could use it at other materials as well, but this is a woodworking channel, so we're going to be doing wood. Again, as treated lumber, but you could also use metals, and you could use feed troughs that are already done. From the research that I've done, there's some heat issues that goes into the dirt and maybe cooking it and causing other kind of stuff. So wood seems to be the preferred method, but you guys can do that research yourself if that's something else. But seeing that you're here, I assume that you're interested in doing a wood garden box. Then you're going to need some sort of hardware, right? The screws. I prefer deck screws. These will hold up to the elements. They're created to do so, you know, in a deck, holding a deck together throughout the elements. I also use them in the patio furniture that I create. You're going to need some sort of a drill bit that matches the deck size screws that you're using to pre-drill those holes. So you're not going to get any splitting or anything like that. And then you're going to need your power tools. Preferably you're not using hand tools, hopefully. So I've already purchased the wood, and I'm going to run through that with you. So I came up with the plans myself. You just kind of come up with the dimensions that you want to use. Mine are going to be 4x8, and they're going to be at least 20 inches tall is what I was aiming for, of course. You want to get 20 to 24. Otherwise, they're kind of going to be too low. You're going to bother your back. I've also got them set up where I'm going to have an edge for you to be able to sit on. So kind of considering some of those creature comforts. But starting out, what I did was I went to the big orange box to purchase the wood. And what I tend to do is really dive into the math, dive into the numbers, because I want to get the wood for the best value that I can. And so what I do is I go size by size, find out what's going to be the cheapest layout for me. I know they need to be 8 foot long, and then from there 4 foot, maybe a little shorter, but as long as I'm working in 4 foot increments after the 8 foot, they're going to suit what I need. And so basically I went every single size, so 8 to 12 to 16, and figured out what was going to have the best price for me. And interestingly enough, 16 is not always the best price. This 12 footer was actually the best price. And so I went with the 12 foots of both a 2x12 by 12, and then I went with a 2x10 by 12. And you guys know when you're purchasing lumber, that 2x4, that 2x6, that 2x whatever, that is not the actual dimension. So here's that 2x12, and that's actually 2 and 1, 2, 3/8 is what I've got right here, all right? And then I've got a 2x10, which actually comes out as a 2x9 1/4, okay? So with those two combined, I'm gonna be just over that 20-inch mark that I wanted to be in height. So these will be my sides, all right? So with those two combined right here, I've got 20 3/4, okay? That's gonna be how my sides will be combined. And so instead of doing 3 or 4 at that point, 2x6s, that would have cost more to go up that size, I decided to make one of the sides will be a 2x12, one of the sides will be a 2x10, all right? And so from the math that I did to put that together, that was getting the most bang for my buck. These prices could be different in the areas that you're in, so do the math. Then for the top plates, for sitting on, for the sides, I'm gonna use 2x6s, and they were actually the cheapest in the 8-foot format. If I jump these up to the 16-footer format, they were actually more expensive. So that's where some of that doesn't make sense. You would think you're going to get it cheaper because you're buying a 16-foot board. No, it was actually cheaper to get the 8s on that one. So again, that's why you kind of want to run through that math. And then I also have some 2x4s, which I'll be using for some of the bracing on the interior, as well as the 2 ends cap for the sitting on. I went with the 2x12x12 and the 2x10x12 because of the cost effectiveness of that. And this works perfectly for my project because I know my beds are going to be 4x8, and so 8 foot being the length and 4 foot being the width, so it's perfect. I have a 12-foot board, chop 4 feet off, I'm good to go. And to make it even easier, I went ahead and had the big orange box cut them for me. So what I have here is, these are the equivalents of the 12-foot boards. Here's the 8-foot of both. There's the 4-foot of both, all right? And again, I had an employee there at the store do it for me. There's no fee to that, of course. Makes it easier to get it into your vehicle. Maybe you don't have a truck. You can still get this stuff home. You know, you wouldn't want to cut this any lower than that 8 foot if that's the size you're going to be. But 8 foot will fit in most vehicles. Maybe you got to make a couple trips, but they'll cut it at the store for you so you can get it in your vehicle. Again, I went with the 8-footers on these two, so those ones were just fine and ready to go. So sometimes plans can be intimidating for some folks, putting some things together, putting a thought together. These are pretty simple. They're a box. You're just, screwing ends together, figuring out the dimensions you want. If you're doing 8-footers, it's usually the most common. You could go any length you want. You're gonna have to butt them up and do some sort of bracing to connect them, but you can always go shorter. Some people do 7-footer. Maybe it's depending on how much space you have in your backyard. Maybe they're gonna be 4-foot squares. You just sit down with a piece of paper, a notebook, draw out the shape, rough dimensions that you wanna work with, and build from there. But if plans are intimidating for you, I will be making the plans available. Again, they're super simple. But if that's something that you need, you'll have access to that link as well. All right, guys, so I'm just about to jump into actually putting these things together, and I just wanted to walk through the actual tools that we'll be using for this, all right? The tools we're gonna need for this job are pretty simple. If you're lacking any of these, there's typically something that you can use instead. So if budget's an issue, you don't necessarily need to run out and buy any of these necessarily, but we'll cover some of that. Hopefully you have some of these tools. Definitely makes the job easier, but I'm just gonna run through it. So a drill. Drill is definitely, I would say, one of the more needed things. You could certainly get away with driving the screws into the wood, but you could potentially end up with a lot of cracking, splitting, checking from doing so. So I don't recommend doing that. I would say you need to have at least a drill, even if it's a corded drill. Just got to run an extension cord, but those are much cheaper. You can find those for 20, 30 bucks. Amazon or Harbor Freight or something like that. So, but I have a drill. Drill is honestly what I started out with. This one's gotten some use. You can see the paint and such on it. All of my tools have gotten a fair share of use, but as long as you take care of them, they're gonna last. Batteries might run out after a while, but you can replace things like that. But so at least having a drill, you will have to change out the drill for the driver for the screw. So every time you're drilling versus driving that screw, you're gonna have to keep changing that out. But you could get away with having just a drill to do the job, all right? But from there, I then have my impact driver. That way I don't have to do that. So I've already got it preloaded with my screw bit, and I've got my drill bit preloaded on here. So 1-to-1, I've got a battery for both. I don't have to do any exchanging there, all right? Next up would be a saw. As I mentioned before, I already had the big orange box. Cut these down to basically the lengths that I need, all right? The only thing that I'm gonna need to cut are these 2x4s for the actual bracing, for creating a lip for me to put the seat side on, which I'll cover a little later in the build. But I could have had him cut that down for me there too. I could have had him take these 2x4s and cut them into the 21-inch strips if that's what I needed to do. So if you plan this out right, you might not even need the circular saw. But if you don't have a circular saw, you could get away with a good old-fashioned hand saw. Just takes a little longer, a little bit more elbow grease, but perfectly okay. If you're doing this thing on a budget, you can get away with something like this instead of a circular saw. But maybe you could borrow one from somebody, a neighbor. So next, we're gonna want a tape measure for making all the measurements that we're gonna need for lining up the boards, clearly. Of course, the deck screws that we already talked about, your preference there. Then, of course, a pencil for marking every measurement, razor for sharpening the pencil. You could also make your marks with the razor instead of the pencil. I also like to have a speed square as my preferred for making all those measurements. I can just make the line right across, squares everything up to the side of the board. Quickest to use right there. If you're doing any angles and stuff like that, you could use this as well. For the bigger boards, I have a bigger square. All right, again, you don't necessarily need these. You could certainly mark just on the edge, let the circular saw drive across, or make your best guess with the hand saw. Not all of these tools are required, but they're certainly gonna make the job easier. If budget's an issue, the cost of lumber is pretty high right now, especially to get treated lumber. So certainly looking for where you can save money wherever you can. Another thing with these raised beds, you can create them a layer at a time. So say this year you can only afford to do one layer. Next year you could build those layers up, right? You could build one box, one layer. Next year you could put a layer on that, add another box, first layer, or whatever you needed to do. But you could start out one layer at a time, and you could certainly stack these later. So now I'm gonna get into actually assembling them. I have come up with the plans, basically a square, right, is what we're gonna be putting together. But I am actually gonna offset the ends with a large end and a short end on the top and the bottoms. So that way they'll kind of sit one inside the other on the end, and reverse them on the other side. But that way I'll get a little bit more way to attach them versus just using the bracing. I'll be able to use the boxes themselves to attach each other. But I'm gonna cover that when we get into it, when we get to that part. All right, guys, and so definitely starting out, again, I said the drill is the minimal thing that I would get. That's what I would purchase first. That's what I had when I first started out. It's all I had, to the point where a guy that I know, I'm pretty close with, he came over and was kind of making fun of me that I was using this for driving screws instead of using an impact driver. And then, without even asking me, without even telling me, he ordered me this whole set. This is not the drill I had. He ordered me a whole set of DeWalt tools, gifted them to me. He's at a point in life where he's in a position to do something like that. Just a huge blessing. And so thank you to him. And but otherwise, you use what you have until you're able to build up to it. All right. So earlier in the video, I mentioned that I wouldn't have to cut anything down. I actually forgot that I had actually planned to build these out at 3.5 feet wide so that we're able to reach across them comfortably. So each of these end pieces, I will actually be cutting these down. I've got my miter saw back here set up to make the cuts really easy, but I certainly could do those with the circular saw, just real easy and quick, that I'm going to do them with the miter saw. So the 6 inches that I pull off of each one of these pieces, so that these are 3.5 foot wide, are going to be reused as blocking for creating the ledge that we'll use for sitting on, as well as reinforcing the sides. So the wood's not going to go to waste by any means, but so I'm going to go ahead and knock those out, and then we'll get to installing. All right, guys, and when you're measuring it, you want to measure from the end that you plan to keep, not just from the end you're going to take off, and try and take those 6 inches off, because you might be wrong. You might not have a full 48 inches board here. This could have a little more, a little less. So you always want to measure from the side that you're planning to keep out to the 42. Since I'm using the miter saw, I am measuring fresh each time. Otherwise, you could pre-mark them as well. So just to show an example of that exact
situation. This is the first board that I cut off at this width. Having the big orange box pre-cut them for me. If had I measured from the outside to that 6 inches, I would have been wrong. All right, so clearly this board was longer and it would not have given me the desired length at the end. So again, measure from the side you're planning to keep to the length you need. All right guys, so now that this part's done, it's time to do some cleanup. Put this miter saw away and I'll move on to getting the forms of the boxes assembled. But before that, grab my magic mess eraser.
All right, so I'm moving into putting these together. As you can see, I'm using a 2x10 and a 2x12 for the end. So 2x10s on the sides here, 2x12 on the ends. And again, I'm gonna do that in reverse on the top piece so that these two boxes, when I stack them together, are gonna fit like a puzzle, right? And that'll allow me to take then the top of each plate, or bottom, depending on how they sit in, but I'm gonna be able to drive a screw from that into the opposing box and help just reinforce all of that without necessarily using all bracing everywhere. So what I'm gonna do here is go ahead and trace my lines that I'm gonna drill into the 2x10s through the plate here, through the 2x12. And I've decided that this line here, if you can see that on this square, when I square this up to the side here, that gets me to just about halfway through the middle of a 2x4, or the width of that 2 inch, right? So that works perfect for me drawing my halfway mark there to mark the holes I'm gonna drill. I'm gonna line them up based on how I wanna space them on this board using, again, the square. So yeah, go ahead and do that. So I'm just using the square to trace my line that I will then make that the center of this board here. Okay. The important part is the center of this 2x4, or 2x10. You definitely want to hit the center of the next end that you're going to be going into. All right. So center matters, spacing of the screws, not so much. You definitely want to get one towards each end and then roughly in the middle. If you're doing 3 like I am, you can do 4. That's all on you. And when you're putting these together, you want to make sure that the ends from this one and this one line up. So if these boards were all for the same width, you could just do that with the top, and you would lift it, make sure it lines up top to top, and then you would mark your holes, right? But for me, since I'm doing 2 different size pieces here, I'm using the bottom, and since I'm doing this in my garage's got an uneven to it, since it slopes slightly out for any type of drainage or anything, I'm using these boards, a couple pieces of scrap pallet wood, just putting that on the corners, and that allows me to find that perfect meetup point right here, all right? And then when I'm happy with the flush here and the flush at the bottom, I will then drill. Okay, and for my drill bit, when I'm drilling pilot holes for screws, I prefer to go one size down versus the actual diameter of the screw. That way I make sure the teeth bite and it's gonna stick in that wood pretty good. All right, so again, make sure you hold the boards together. Don't just trust that the holes are gonna line up. Hold everything tight. Just like that. First screw is in. All right, so that's our first corner assembled there. All right, guys, we're just gonna repeat
the same thing here.
All right guys, so that's it for this side. I'm gonna repeat the same thing on the opposite side and then work on the top box to see how those two are gonna come together. All right guys, so I've actually come up to a bit of a snag from what my plan was, realizing now upon checking some of the measurements that were taken by the associate at the big orange box. These boards were not cut to 8 feet. They are cut to 8 1/8, so I don't know how he got that far off, but it's no big deal. What this does mean is I will now have to actually go back through and cut them down because not every single board's the same. So what I ran into here is setting up the second box and doing it how I wanted to have the pieces kind of fit like a puzzle. They are not gonna fit like that because some of the boards are coming up a little bit longer. So I am instead gonna cut them all down to a true 8 where I want them to fit, where I know they're gonna do what I need them to do. This also means I will be taking this box back apart. Main purpose of me cutting them down at the store was so I could transport them without having to drag big 12-foot boards on my trailer. But certainly still helps to get them in the car. The dimensions still fit what I needed, of course. Now I'm gonna have about 1 inch that I'm taking off of each board, which it's a little frustrating, but the only thing I can suggest from this is maybe double check the guy's measurements on that first board and then go from there. Because had I checked that he measured it correctly on that first board, all the boards after that I would assume would have been good. So once I get those all cut up, we'll jump back into reassembling. All right guys, so here's what we have going on right now. I'm a little halfway through the 2x10s, correcting those to 8 foot, reset up the miter saw, and I'm using my little giant over here for the other end. So working on a budget, working with the tools that you have, you know, it works perfect. You can spread the ladder out a little bit to raise and lower the height until it's at the table you got. All right guys, we're back at square one. I'm about to start putting these boxes together. I just wanted to call out, this is still a viable option if you guys don't have a circular saw or any other type of saw. Certainly a hand saw would work, but it is a viable option. But now going through this, it would make a little sense to maybe be a little more intentional with the guy or the person at the big box store that's helping you cut these. Let them know you need specific measurements. I'm guessing the guy had planned to leave me 1 inch of room just in case or something, but that wasn't exactly the intention I had. And as I went through these, I actually found one board that was cut 1/8 of an inch too short. So I'll end up having to make up for that as I get to that last piece there. But all in all, it's not a big deal. I do have a circular saw, so I went ahead and corrected it. But again, pre-plan what you're doing when you're out there. When you're gonna do this, if you're trying to have them cut them on site, let them know you need very specific measurements. You could even pre-mark them for the person before they cut it. Let them know you need it cut right here. You can pre-mark each board. You can do it right on the cart there in the store, and then go get the guy to get everything cut for you. But otherwise, yeah. So the good news is these ends are already marked. All I gotta do is put the screws in, line everything up, put the screws in. So didn't slow me down too much. Again, I did have to go cut 12 pieces of lumber that I didn't intend to, but getting right back into it. All right guys, so with that first box down, again, I've got 2x10s on the sides, 2x12s on the ends. I'm now gonna take a 2x12 and
and line it up with the side here. And then on this end, I'll be using a 2x10. And again, the idea I had was that this would allow me to connect these boxes without excessive blocking, allowing me to drive through this board into this top. So this lowered 2x12 into this upper 2x12. So it's just one screw in 4 corners, but it's gonna give a bit more rigidity to the total box since I'm putting 2 boxes on top of each other. And again, you could do one box at 2x12 and one box at 2x10 and stack them. You could do two 2x10s. You would only get a total of 18 inches high at that point. But again, for the desired height I was trying to get, that's why I'm doing 2x12 and a 2x10. And again, drawing a line, pre-drilling the holes, making sure everything's lined up. All right, and then I'm putting the screws in. So I am not connecting the 2 boxes together because, as I said, I'm going to move them from my garage to where they're going to live in the backyard. But if you're building them on site, you could go ahead and do that right now. And that is certainly the easiest, not having to move them later. For what I'm doing, I'm not going to drill the hole and connect the 2 boxes or even attempt to line that up, just in case anything shifts from me taking it from here to the backyard. I want to make sure that that hole's going to line up when I put them on site. All right, guys, and that's it. That's the boxes built. I still have to move them. Hopefully, when you're building them, you're doing them on site and you won't have to do that. But with my overall dimensions here, I am at 20 3/4. When I put the caps on these, they're going to have another 1.5 inches there as well. But I'll have a 6-inch, a 2x6 rail going around these that we can sit on and reach in. You don't want to make those rails too big because you're going to take away from your planting area as well as cause shadows on certain spots. So 2x6 I think is perfect. If you're a smaller person, you could do a 2x4 if that's comfortable for you. You could also potentially have those rails sticking off towards the outside. And it might be something we still do, but we'll take a look at that when we get to it. All right, so I'm gonna get the other 2 boxes put together and we'll move on to the next step. All right, so as you can see here, I have a bunch of excess block that I chopped off of the 48-inch boards that I had that are these end caps. So I have all the excess strips and I am gonna be using these for the blocking. One for the rail that I'm gonna be putting around the outside. So that'll go up like this to help add support like that, and I'll put that around each box towards the corners. We'll take some of that blocking, we'll put it towards the middle to prevent any bowing going opposite of each other. So if they're gonna bow, we wanna try and keep those together. So we don't want one top rail going out and the bottom coming in or vice versa. So we're gonna use blocking to keep that together. I also have the 2x4s that I purchased that I'll be using for blocking as well. So plenty of options there for that, but nothing wasted from those end caps that we cut off. We will be reusing those for the blocking as intended. So just one other thing to call out, not all of this wood is gonna be completely squared up to each other. This isn't stuff that we've gone and jointed. We haven't trued it up to each other. Some of these boards could have swelled or shrunk, could be a tad wider, tad shorter. Well, shorter, we've cut them, so that shouldn't happen, but the width, they could be slightly off. This isn't so bad here, about 1/8 on these.
And some of this could just be with putting them together, but some of it certainly is that they are just wider from swelling and shrinking. And if you can make it out, it's kind of noticeable here. These do not need to be perfect, of course. One thing I do know is I have them squared up to the garage floor. And so when I take these boxes out to the backyard, I will just flip them over. I'm gonna have that true side up, the side that's perfectly squared, and that's where I'll be putting my rails. So even if you got a little lip here, you know, as long as you got one good side, you do want to make sure the rails and the ends are completely butted up to each other when you're doing these, so you're not going to have any dirt spilling out. Of course, I'm going to be putting some underlayment, some weed barrier inside the boxes to prevent that. Just stapling it in there before I put the dirt in to help prevent that dirt from coming out. The other thing is, if you're building boxes, as I am, with tapering the two different sizes, you're going to want to keep those two paired together. That way they'll fit when you go back out. Because if any of those boards have any of that width or anything else that might be slightly off with them, they may not fit with another pair. So make sure you keep those two together. You can write on them. You know, I might put A, B, C, D, E, F on each one to make sure they go together, or, you know, whatever sort of code you want to use. But I would keep them together just to make sure you don't have any problems when you get them on site. But again, if you're building them on site, that doesn't apply to you. All right, guys, so I just wanted to give you an example of how some of this board, since they're not trued up, we didn't plane them, we didn't join them, anything like that. They're not all exactly the same width. This is an exact example of that. So these boxes are matched perfectly at the bottom there. And so you would hope that when you get up to this point, they're going to be perfectly aligned. That is not the case. So they are not perfectly aligned. This is going to be the side that I end up putting down on the ground, which is perfectly fine. I know the top is all perfectly squared up where I want it to be. But again, just wanted to call out that since this isn't like the wood that we're using to build furniture or something like that, we did not cut these down to all the exact dimensions, the exact stock. You could certainly do that, but for a garden box, it's not something I would waste my time doing. Expect some of the stuff not to line up perfectly on any other project. Something like this would drive me crazy. But again, matching up to the bottom there, which will now be the top, it is perfect. So that's the side that I'm going to care about. The other thing is, I wouldn't want to line these up and cause a gap in the middle here. If I were to line up the top, which I wouldn't want to do, it would allow dirt to come through the middle here, because it would cause that gap to then shift up to the top here. So, or vice versa here on the end, it would cause this to shift up rather. And so we definitely don't want to do that. So definitely make sure the boards are seamed in the middle perfectly, and then we'll put those uneven spots on the bottom. All right, guys, again, I'm blocking at the corners just so I can make sure what I'm referencing off of is going to be square, all right, square-ish. With a crack in the concrete like this, side to side may not be even. So I know if I put a block down, it's pretty easy to reference to that. You could certainly use the ground, but I'm probably going to be teeter-tottering with this crack that's here in the concrete, this seam that was placed here. You're going to be pushing down on one side in order to get it square. And so instead of fighting that, just going to block them. It's good that the days have been longer, but I'm still running out of daylight, so I'm really hoping to knock out this third box. The screws I'm using are also self-tapping, so if you're not paying attention, they will really try to run from you and get deeper in the wood than you would have preferred.
right, so for these 6-foot rails that I'm also going to be using as our spot to sit, I want to find the middle. To do that, you're going to take your square, make sure you're starting from the same spot, draw diagonally, that's your middle point. So trace that down to the end, as long as you got a square cut here that you're working off of. So roughly right there, just working to make sure we got the middle of the spot we're going to attach it. I'm aiming to be half and half, that way I've got blocking that will be underneath here, and we'll be doing that next. But otherwise I'm just cutting my 2x4s to be here, my 2x6s to be up here, and I am going to taper those. The 2x4 is going to hang over here, and then I'm going to stagger them one after the other, and I'll show you that in a picture here soon. Alright, so what I've done is I've cut down basically some 6-inch blocks. This is going to be for just the corners, and all I'm going to do here is line up with the top, because again I want that seat plate to be able to rest right on it, and then I'm going to stagger them like that. Alright, so I didn't do any type of specific cutting. It's roughly 6-inch blocks, making sure, calculating the wood that you have to get down to what you need. As you can see, as the boxes came together, like we talked about, some of the width of the wood is not exact, so we'll be accounting for that, roughly tapering that into working its way down that plank. So it's going to kind of taper that myself, and otherwise, yeah, I'm going to drill these just like you normally would, pre-drill them, pilot holes, and then same screws. I'm going to do 2 in each one, and these will just help be the rails. As I said, there's nothing specific at this point. Measurements are just kind of rough, and as you're kind of fitting this going forward, staggering the blocks where you think it's best. You might not necessarily need to go one on either side. You could potentially get away with just one, and that could cover the whole corner. You could also cut some 45-degree angles if you really wanted to, but I'm not going to get into it like that. And this doesn't have to be any type of perfect, as it is going to be covered up with that other plate. Again, working some amount of a taper there, rough estimate. All right, and then this is what that'll look like. Over top of the corner. Again, lining up that middle, and that's what it'll look like. And I'll be able to screw into here as well as into the center. Definitely reinforced, and then the same going this way. That is roughly it, and then I'll do the same with this 2x6 coming down this way. Again, you're going to want to put rail blocking every so often. So I'm going to put 2x4 by 1 foot staggered on alternate sides in the middle. As you can see, I used some of those end caps that I took off of the 2x8s, 2x12s, used those for the blocking in the middle here, attaching top and bottom together so they don't have any bowing going out or in from either level. I did it on both sides. I don't need to necessarily do it on the ends, but you could. Not as much board that's going to pry apart. So yeah, I'll get the rest blocked out, and then we'll get those caps put on top. So it's better to measure out the center of the board to make sure you're going to line up exactly where you want that screw to be in the middle of the board below. But just using my fingers, I can kind of feel that as well. But again, for making sure it's spot on, you could measure to the center. Alright guys, so there's that first box completed. I'll be putting in 2 more here. I just got to move that dirt, but otherwise they are completed. As I had mentioned, I did decide to run the 2x4 stacked against the 2x6 and then on and on, rather than just running a 2x4 the length, because the 2x6s were not long enough to reach the entire box. All right, so there's those other 2 boxes. I'll get them put in place. If you guys have any comments or suggestions, anything you thought could have been better, or questions you have, please leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to those. I will be making these plans available. I'll have a link in my description for you to access those as well. They are a pretty simple build, but sometimes even something like this can be overwhelming, so I've got my full cut list and sizes and everything. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos, and we'll continue to make some sawdust. Take care.